Have you ever tuned your radio at midnight only to hear something that wasn't quite meant for the living? Someone reaching out through the static, calling from a place you can't quite understand. That's how it all started for me. One quiet night, I stumbled upon a broadcast unlike any other. It wasn't music, nor was it a late-night talk show. It was voices that seemed trapped between worlds desperate for help. And once you listen, the broadcast doesn't just fade away, it lingers like a shadow you can shake. It all began when I moved into an old house on the edge of a quiet suburb. Nothing special really. A small two-story place with creaky wooden floors, peeling wallpaper, and a radio that looked decades old, sitting dusty on a corner table. The kind of house that's forgotten by time, but still holds memories in its walls. Memories you don't notice at first because everything feels normal, just like any other new home. The neighborhood was peaceful during the day, with kids playing down the street and neighbors waving as they watered their gardens. But at night, there was a certain stillness that settled deep, almost like the world itself was holding its breath. My days were filled with the usual routines: work, cooking, the hum of television, but every night I found myself drawn to that old radio. It wasn't functional at first. Static filled the speaker whenever I tried to tune in, crackling with bursts of white noise. But then one night, exactly at midnight, a voice came through, low and grainy, like it was traveling across time and space. A voice that whispered my name and spoke of a world beyond, where the lost lingered, trapped in a loop of forgotten sorrow. At first, I thought it was some kind of prank, or maybe a leftover broadcast from a station long gone. But the voice was urgent, real. It told stories of souls caught between life and death, begging for help that no one could give. And as I listened, I realized this broadcast wasn't just a show, it was a warning. Yet there was something hypnotic about it, something that made me want to keep listening, to understand more. Night after night, the voices returned, sharing more than stories, whispers of places where the living and dead crossed paths, where the past refused to let go. And with every broadcast, I felt a subtle pull, like the radio wasn't just playing to me, but reaching for me. The house creaked with the settling of age. Shadows lengthened across the walls. Outside, the quiet suburb seemed to fade into something else, a place where time bent and rules bent with it. But inside, everything was still familiar. Just me, my thoughts, and the radio's ghostly whispers. It was a normal life, or at least it was supposed to be. The first few nights passed uneventfully. Aside from the midnight broadcasts, the voices spoke in riddles, fragments of stories from unseen places. Some sounded sorrowful, others urgent, as if desperate to communicate, but trapped behind a veil of static. I remember one particular voice, soft, and trembling, pleading for someone to listen carefully and help us find the way. It sent a chill through me, but also stirred a strange curiosity. Who were these voices, and why had they chosen my radio to speak through? The days blurred into each other. I'd wake up tired, the radio's words lingering in my mind like a haunting melody. I started to notice little things around the house, small shifts in the air, a feeling of being watched, though nothing ever appeared. The radio was always silent during the day, but at night it transformed into a portal to something I couldn't explain. One evening, while searching the attic, I found an old journal tucked beneath a loose floorboard. Its leather cover was cracked with age, and the pages yellowed with time. Flipping through it, I realized it belonged to the previous tenant, a man named Harold, who'd lived here decades before. His writing was erratic, filled with entries about voices on the radio, strange figures lurking in the shadows, and a growing fear that he was being pulled into something beyond his understanding. He wrote of a midnight broadcast, just like the one I'd been hearing, and how it had slowly taken over his nights, whispering secrets and warnings. The final entry was barely legible, the ink smeared as if written in haste. They're coming through. If you find this, do not listen. The broadcast is not what it seems. It's a trap. I stared at the page, heart pounding. Was I following the same path Harold had? Was the radio trying to warn me or to ensnare me like it had him? The house seemed to grow colder, the shadows deeper. Yet despite the fear knotting in my stomach, I couldn't turn the radio off. It called to me. That night, as the clock struck 12, the broadcast began again. The voice was clearer now, more insistent. Help us trapped. Don't let the silence consume you. The words echoed in the room, wrapping around me like a cold breath. I felt drawn toward the radio, as if it held some truth I needed to uncover, even if that truth was terrifying. Outside, the world was still. The quiet suburb had slipped into something unrecognizable, where time slowed and reality twisted. But inside the house held its secrets close. And as I listened to the voices trapped somewhere beyond, I realized this was just the beginning. The radio was more than an old machine, it was a gateway. And once you tune in, the afterlife might just tune back. The nights that followed grew heavier with an unsettling presence. It began subtly soft footsteps echoing down the hallway when I was alone. The faintest rustle of fabric, though no one was there. The radio's static seemed to pulse in rhythm with my heartbeat as if alive. And then came the knocks. Every night at precisely 3 o'clock, a slow, deliberate knocking on the front door would break the silence. I'd freeze, holding my breath, and peek through the peephole. Nothing. The porch was always empty, shrouded in darkness, thick enough to swallow sound. I tried to convince myself it was the wind or an animal, but the knocking never wavered in timing or pattern. It was too consistent, too deliberate to be random. One evening, drawn by a mix of dread and curiosity, I opened the door only to find an old battered cassette tape lying on the doorstep. No note, no sign of who left it. When I played it on the radio's cassette player, a voice filled the room. Voice I recognized from the midnight broadcasts. It was Harold, the previous tenant. His message was fragmented, desperate. They're here. The broadcast is not a lifeline, it's a chain. Break free before it's too late. If you hear this, you're already caught. The tape ended with static, then silence. That night, sleep was impossible. The air in the house thickened, pressing down on my chest. Shadows moved just beyond sight, and whispers floated in the silence, barely audible, but unmistakably real. When I reached for the radio, the dial spun on its own, stopping at a frequency I hadn't tuned before. The broadcast began anew, the voices no longer just whispers, but clear, insistent calls for help. Then I found it, the old tenant's diary, hidden beneath a loose floorboard in the living room. It wasn't just a journal. It was a record of a slow descent into madness, haunted by voices on the airwaves and a creeping realization that the radio was a trap, a gateway, not just for voices, but for souls. The last entry chilled me to my core. The broadcast steals time. Those who listen too long are never truly alive again. They become echoes, forever part of the static. The house, the radio, the voices, they were part of something bigger, something ancient and twisted. And I was no longer just a listener. I was part of the broadcast now. But how far could this go? Was there a way out, or was I destined to become just another voice, trapped between the waves? The nights grew darker, not just outside, but inside my mind. The line between waking and dreaming blurred as the broadcast's grip tightened. I discovered that certain rules governed the voices. World rules whispered in cryptic warnings. Don't look in the mirror after 2 a.m. Never speak their names aloud, and never ever lie while listening. Breaking them invited something worse than fear, an invisible tether, pulling you deeper into the broadcast's shadow. One night, unable to resist, I glanced at the mirror across the hallway at 2:05 a.m. For a moment, my reflection wavered, then flickered into something else, a pale face with hollow eyes, staring back, mouthing silent pleas. I recoiled, heart pounding, but the image lingered even when I turned away. That was when I realized the voices weren't just trapped souls. They were warnings encoded in torment, and the broadcast was their prison and their prison guard. I started noticing patterns. The radio crackled louder whenever I lied or tried to ignore the voices. Sometimes faint sobbing echoed from the upstairs room, though I lived alone. The old journal mentioned a tragic history, The house had once been a place of cruel confinement where a child was kept gagged and hidden for 7 years. The child's spirit, they said, was tied to the radios, broadcast crying out for release. Each night, the voices grew more vivid, weaving fragments of memories and warnings that teased the edges of sanity. I tried to fight it, to resist the pull, but the more I fought, the stronger the broadcast became. It was as if the radio fed on fear and curiosity alike, weaving its web tighter around me. And then there was the realization that the broadcast was no longer just a voice on the radio. It was alive, reacting, waiting. Sometimes I'd catch whispers saying my name. Sometimes the static-shaped words just beyond comprehension. It felt like the radio wanted me to cross over to join the endless chorus of lost voices trapped in its waves. I was no longer a passive listener. I was part of their story, now caught in a trap that had no clear escape. That night, I decided to break the rules. The voices had warned me enough, and fear was no longer the master. It was curiosity, raw and reckless, pushing me forward. I stayed awake well past midnight, waiting for the broadcast to begin. When the clock struck 3, the radio crackled to life, louder and clearer than ever before. Then I heard something new, a soft knocking, not at the door this time, but from inside the house. It was coming from my bedroom. Heart racing, I turned on the flashlight and aimed it toward the corner where an old porcelain doll sat on a dusty shelf. The beam flickered, and for a terrifying moment, I saw it shift, crawling, inching closer to the edge. Frozen, I watched as the doll's glassy eyes seemed to gleam with a sinister life. The radio's static surged, filling the room with a chilling message carved in whispered agony. Don't sleep when I am awake. I realized then that the broadcast wasn't just a warning, it was a prison, and I had just stepped inside. The radio's voices weren't asking for help. They were bait, luring the living into a trap where time and reality twisted and escape became impossible. I tried to leave, but the house had changed. Doors led to hallways I didn't recognize. Shadows blocked my path, and the knocking followed relentlessly. I was trapped in a loop, a broadcast of my own becoming, one more lost soul, calling out in the static. Now, if you ever find an old radio playing at midnight and hear voices begging for help, remember this: some broadcasts are better left unheard. Because once you tune in, you may never tune out. The radio falls silent, but the echo remains. The night I first saw her, everything seemed perfectly ordinary. The kind of quiet, uneventful evening where the hum of distant traffic and the occasional rustling of leaves were the only sounds that filled the air. I was driving back from a late shift, tired but relieved to be heading home, when I noticed her standing by the side of the road. She was a young woman, drenched in the pale moonlight, her clothes slightly out of place for the chilly autumn night. I pulled over without hesitation, The kind of reflex that feels automatic in moments like these. She didn't say much, just a soft, almost hesitant thank you as she slid into the passenger seat. But something about her felt off. Not threatening exactly, but like a shadow hovering just beyond clear sight, a flicker that your eyes catch only out of the corner of your vision. We drove in silence for a few miles, the only noise, the soft crackling of the heater and the steady rhythm of the tires against asphalt. When I finally glanced over to speak, she was gone. I blinked, thinking I must have imagined it. Maybe she slipped out while I was adjusting the radio. But the seatbelt was still buckled, and the faint scent of her perfume lingered in the air, cold and bittersweet. It wasn't the first time I had heard the story everyone around here had. The vanishing hitchhiker, they called her. A ghostly figure who appeared on lonely roads, always asking for a ride, but disappearing before reaching her destination. Only this time, it felt different. Because in the days that followed, the town whispered about her again, but not just as a ghost story. There was talk of something darker, something buried beneath the surface of those fading tales. Old secrets clawing their way back into daylight, threatening to shake the quiet foundation of the community I had just made my home. I moved here to escape the noise of the city, to find peace in a place where nothing much ever happened. But now I'm not so sure that was the right choice. It turns out that some stories don't stay buried, they wait watching until someone comes along who's willing to listen. The house I rented was a modest one, nestled at the edge of a sleepy suburb that seemed frozen in time. White picket fences, tidy lawns, and the faint smell of wood smoke from chimneys made it feel like a postcard from a simpler era. Moving in had been easy enough, and for the first few days, everything was as normal as I'd hoped. The creaks and groans of an older home gave it character, nothing more. My routine settled into a predictable rhythm. Wake up, work, come home, repeat. The kind of life that most people around here led. I even made a few acquaintances, a neighbor who waved from her porch, the local barista who remembered my order, a mailman with stories about the town's history. Still beneath the surface of this calm, there was a subtle tension I couldn't shake. The locals were friendly, but there was a hesitation in their eyes when I asked about certain places or people. I chalked it up to typical small-town reticence, the kind of protective silence that guards old wounds. The road where I'd first seen the hitchhiker wasn't far from my new home. A stretch of pavement flanked by dense trees and flickering street lamps that seemed to dim just as you approached. I'd driven it countless times, usually late at night, and each time I felt the same prickling sensation, like the air itself held a secret. I started hearing stories from the locals after I mentioned seeing the woman that night. They spoke in hushed tones about a girl named Emily who had disappeared decades ago, along that very road. Some said she'd been struck by a car. Others whispered of darker things, abuse, betrayal, a tragedy the town was too ashamed to admit. But there was one thing they all agreed on. Emily's spirit was said to haunt that road, seeking a way home, or perhaps justice. I didn't believe in ghosts. Not really. But every time I drove past that spot, I found myself glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see her there again. A part of me wanted to reach out to understand what she needed. Another part wanted to drive faster, to leave the eerie feeling behind. My nights grew restless. I'd catch myself staring out the window long after the world had gone dark, wondering about the lives that had intersected with that lonely road. What if Emily's story wasn't just a myth? What if it was a warning? As the days turned into weeks, the strange occurrences began. At first, it was just subtle things, a misplaced object here, a shadow flickering just out of sight there. Nothing I could explain, but enough to make me question the comfort of the life I thought I'd found. The first night, something truly unsettled me. I was lying in bed, the soft hum of the heater barely masking the quiet outside. At exactly 3 o'clock, a sharp knock echoed through the house, sharp and deliberate, as if someone was demanding attention. I froze, my heart pounding in the silence that followed. I peeked through the window, but there was no one there. No footprints, no figure, just the empty street bathed in pale moonlight. I tried to brush it off. Maybe a branch had knocked against the window, or a neighbor playing a prank. But the knock came again the very next night, exactly at 3, and the night after that. Each time, I found myself waiting in the dark, half expecting to see something or someone that never appeared. The local librarian told me that Emily's story was far from simple. She handed me an old worn book filled with clippings and notes collected over the years. The deeper I dug, the more I uncovered about the tragic young woman who had vanished without a trace. According to the records, Emily was the daughter of one of the town's founding families, a bright girl with a future that was cruelly cut short. The circumstances of her disappearance were murky, with rumors of foul play and secrets that the town elders desperately wanted to keep buried. Then one evening, I found a diary hidden in the attic of my new house. It was old, leather-bound, and brittle with age. Inside were pages filled with a desperate, trembling hand, Emily's hand. The diary chronicled her life, her fears, and the dark shadow that had fallen over her family. The last entry stopped mid-sentence, and beneath it, written in a different scrawl, was a chilling message. "They're still here, watching, waiting." I couldn't sleep that night. The air felt heavier, the shadows in my room thicker. I kept hearing soft whispers just beyond, hearing words I couldn't quite catch. but that sent a cold shiver down my spine. I was beginning to wonder if this wasn't just a ghost story after all. Something more was happening, something alive. The days that followed blurred into a strange half-waking nightmare. Objects moved when I wasn't looking. Footsteps echoed in empty rooms. I caught glimpses of a pale figure at the edge of my vision, always just beyond reach. And with each encounter, the feeling grew stronger that Emily wasn't just a memory. She was trying to tell me something, or warn me. And that's when I noticed the pattern. It wasn't random. The knocks, the whispers, the fleeting shadows, they all seemed tied to certain times and places, like a message hidden in plain sight. The more I paid attention, the more the story twisted into something I couldn't have imagined, something that threatened to unravel not just my sanity, but the very fabric of the town I had come to call home. The realization hit me on a rainy evening when the wind rattled the windows and the house creaked under the weight of the storm. I was pacing the living room, diary clutched tightly in my hands, when suddenly the room went deathly silent. The usual hum of the heater died down. The rain slowed to a murmur, and even the clock seemed to stop ticking. That's when I noticed it, a faint glow emanating from the attic stairs, pulsing like a heartbeat. Compelled by a mixture of dread and curiosity, I climbed the narrow staircase, each step creaking beneath my weight. The attic was colder than the rest of the house, and the air tasted metallic, as if I was breathing in something ancient and heavy. There in the corner lay a small, dusty box covered in cobwebs. Inside were old photographs, letters, and a tarnished locket engraved with the initials EM. As I sifted through the artifacts, a name kept echoing in my mind: Emily Monroe. Her story was no longer just a ghost tale. It was a twisted, dark history of a girl who had suffered unspeakable cruelty. But there was more. A secret the town had buried deep. I found an old newspaper clipping about a mysterious figure spotted along the same road where I'd first seen the hitchhiker. The article described sightings of a pale woman in a flowing white dress who appeared to drivers late at night asking for a ride, before vanishing without a trace. Locals had dismissed it as folklore, but the pattern was clear and terrifying. The more I uncovered, the more the rules of this haunting revealed themselves. Emily's spirit appeared only at certain times, always, on stormy nights, always at exactly 3 a.m. She was drawn to those who had some connection to her past or the town's dark secrets. And there was a chilling consequence to breaking the invisible rules. One night, ignoring every instinct, I stayed out past 3 a.m., driving down the road where I'd first met her. The street lights flickered violently, and the temperature dropped so suddenly my breath fogged the windshield. Then in the rearview mirror, she appeared again, her face pale and sorrowful, but her eyes filled with something darker, a warning. I realized then that this wasn't just a restless spirit seeking closure. Emily was bound by a curse tied to a secret that had festered in the town for decades, something that could destroy more than just her memory. And the more I ignored the warnings, the closer I came to unraveling a truth that some forces would kill to keep hidden. That night, the rules shattered. I decided to confront whatever was haunting me, driven by a mix of fear and stubbornness. I parked the car under the cold glow of a flickering street lamp, the rain now a steady drumming chorus on the roof. My heart hammered as I stepped out, clutching the diary tightly, the leather worn smooth by my fingers. The road stretched into darkness, the trees lining it like silent sentinels. I called out softly, "Emily," my voice trembling. The wind picked up, swirling around me, carrying a whisper that seemed almost like a sigh. Then she appeared more clearly than ever before, standing just at the edge of the tree line. Her white dress fluttered in the gusts, and her eyes held a sorrow so deep it pulled at my soul. But there was something else, too, a cold, calculating gleam that set my skin crawling. She stepped closer, and as she did, the world seemed to distort, the street lamp's light bending unnaturally, shadows stretching and twisting. I tried to reach out to ask what she wanted, but before I could speak, she raised a hand and the air grew thick and heavy like walking underwater. Suddenly, I was flooded with visions, fragments of the past. I saw Emily not as a ghost, but as a girl alive and terrified. She was trapped in a house much like mine, silenced and hidden away by those she trusted most. I saw the betrayal, the violence, and the dark secret the town buried to protect its own. Then the visions twisted, showing me faces I recognized from around town people. I had spoken to people who smiled kindly, yet hid something sinister behind their eyes. The truth hit me like a thunderclap. Emily's disappearance wasn't an accident. It was a cover-up, a conspiracy stretching through generations. And her spirit, the vanishing hitchhiker, wasn't just lost. She was seeking justice, revenge, or something even darker. The night air cracked with a sudden chill, and I realized too late that I had crossed a line. The haunting was no longer about warning or memory. It was about a reckoning. I turned to run, but the shadows closed in whispering secrets I was never meant to hear. Back in the safety of my home, the diary lay open on the table, but the last page had changed. Scrawled across it in what looked like fresh ink were the words, "Some truths vanish with the light, but some never leave." And the hitchhiker, she had returned. But this time, she was bringing the town's darkest secret with her.